Hello, my name is Albert Cordova, and I'm applying for the position there at Sam Houston State University. And as part of the requirement, I need to present a media presentation over a course content. So what I've chosen is Chapter 7 for my undergraduate course concerning motor development. And this particular chapter is looking at the information processing and motor control. So with that being said, I'm going to be looking and particular delivering content concerning attention and memory. Concerning that, there are a couple models out there concerning how we process information. The one that gets used quite a bit and is the one that I discuss in my class is the information processing model. In this model, we have sensory input, we have processing, and then we have a desired output. Under sensory input, that's where you get all of the stimuli coming into the system. Into the system here refers to the programming, the processing involved in that. And here you use the different modalities, whether it's visual, kinesthetic, auditory, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. The one that I particularly pay attention to in my class is kinesthetic and, of course, visual. Those are the two most important modalities that we kind of consider, especially for motor behavior. So you get the information coming in, the sensory input. We process that information along with the processing. There's a memory component, there's processing speed, and of course the programming involved into selecting a desired output. The model is attention. So you got to be attending to the things. The notion behind attention is that our attention is limited. We could only attend to one thing at a time. So what we got to do is we split that up. We attend to one thing, then we switch over to another thing and another thing. A lot of this attention or the resources that we use for attention can be fine-tuned, so to speak. So we could either make ourselves more alert, we could prepare our system, we could practice, we could increase our capacity by practicing and using different strategies to increase our attention. And of course, the other thing that we would sometimes look at concerning attention is the selective attention. In other words, the ability to select and attend to meaningful information. This is what most athletes do, especially the more experienced athletes, the more expert in their fields. They tend to pay attention to the relevant information that is going to be used to have a desired output. This past couple of weeks ago, there was the Super Bowl Sunday, and so in that situation, there was this particular play that came down. The game came down to a particular play in the end, and this individual had to selectively attend to the defensive player had to selectively attend to the meaningful information, the formation of how the team was lined up. Based on that, he even when he got interviewed, he did mention this defensive player did mention that he remembered and he had been coached. He had seen this formation. He had paid attention to the selective meaningful information from that formation, and he knew he had a very good guess as to where the ball was going to be thrown. And well, we know the results of that output plan. So he was definitely alert. He had prepared the system. He reacted to that reaction time. And what we do know with general populations is that at a certain age, we start getting plateauing with our reaction time, and then we start slowing down after a certain age. So elderly and the very young children are about 3 or 5 times slower than someone that is like college age or young adult. So going back to the idea of attention being limited, we have to divide our attention. One of the things that we have to do is we attend to one thing and then we divide our attention to another thing. The problem with this is that certain types of environments or stimulus could definitely interfere with what is being presented. What I mean by that is that here in the state of Texas, and particularly in the city of San Antonio in Texas, it is against the law to have any handheld device as you are driving. Now, as you are an expert in driving or you have been driving for some years, it becomes more of an automatic response, an output. And we sometimes as adults get careless. We think that because it's become so automatic and it's almost like second nature now because of that practice, we think that we free up our attention on other things. But the reality is concerning driving, it's a complex task. You got to be monitoring and attending to many various environments and stimulus. And as time goes on, and you do have these distractions, these interference, whether it's texting, putting up makeup, like on this picture here, that's definitely going to interfere with how you are driving. You would start wavering, and you have a little bit more variability in your driving. Not only that, you might not be able to be as hold the constant speed with that. You will not be able to track whether someone's coming into your lane or not. So there is a limitation with that, and that's why, like I said, in the city of San Antonio, it's against the law. Well, one thing to be very careful with is this idea of, even though we could still talk to someone on the phone, and here in San Antonio, it's allowed for us to have Bluetooth or hands-free types of devices that would allow us to communicate with someone else. The problem with that is that that person that you're speaking with is on the other line on the phone. They're not in the same environment. So there is a distinction between someone sitting right next to you and speaking with that person as opposed to speaking over the phone. When you are speaking over the phone, that other person is not in that environment. So if there is a car coming into your lane, that person is not able to direct you and to cue you up as to that person coming into your lane. Whereas in the person that's sitting right next to you definitely has the ability to see the environment that you're in and also direct you and direct your attention to the meaningful information, meaning that car's coming into your lane. The other thing that we do have to consider is the type of conversation matters, because depending on the conversation that is being discussed, that will definitely pull some of your attentional resources. So if you are on the phone, or whether you're talking to someone that's right next to you, and they're telling you some very insightful, very meaningful information, it's going to pull some of your resources. So the example that I always give to my students is that if you were dating someone and you had proposed, and this was your ideal, your soulmate in your eyes, and so you go along, you've been dating with this individual for 4 years, and you're about to get married, and then all of a sudden you're on the phone, you're driving home from work, and you got on the phone, she's calling you, and so you pick up the phone, and then she just tells you that she wants to be friends. What kind of resources, attentional resources, is she going to pull from you? She's drastically going to pull, and your driving is going to be tremendously affected by that. That will be the same case if that person was sitting right next to you. So there is a difference between the types of conversation and whether the person is either there with you in the same environment, or whether they're somewhere else. We got to be very careful with that, because we have the statistics that show that there are tremendous amounts of accidents caused by those distractions. So selective attention here is the ability to attend to relevant information. And the classical way that this gets described to classes and things like that is the cocktail party phenomenon. In that situation, there was a social setting, and there was various groups in the social setting. And in one particular group, an individual hears their name being called in another group. So this individual, let's say the name was Tom. Tom hears his name called or being discussed in this other group. He is definitely going to, that name to him has been given to him. He's had his name for his whole life. So it means a lot. The word Tom, the name Tom, is very meaningful to Tom. And so when he hears this name being discussed in this other group, he's definitely going to be paying attention to that situation. It might not be him that they're talking about. There might be a different Tom. But nevertheless, that is very meaningful to him. One thing that I tell my students is that with selective attention is a lot of our students are always asking me, well, what's the meaningful information? In other words, what's going to be on the test? And so I always tell my students, well, that is this particular keyword will be on the test. So I kind of direct their attention to that. We know that developmentally, the younger you are, younger than 5 years of age, the easier it is for you to get distracted. So you could be paying attention to relevant information, and if something else is introduced, you are definitely, it's going to have the potential to interfere with what is going on and your plan of action. As you get older, you get a little bit better at doing that. You get better at dividing your attention. Not only that, but then you get better at selectively attending to things. And that's where those expert compared to novice players come into play. Those expert individuals, those expert individuals that have numerous years of practice and training, well, they're definitely going to be looking at particular relevant information concerning the stimulus that they would need to be looking at. Whereas someone that is just beginning a sport might not be looking at the relevant information that is needed for them to make the appropriate response. So concerning memory, there's two types of memory. There's recognition and recall. One is more primitive. It's easier than the other. An example of a recognition memory is multiple choice. A multiple choice question is a recognition memory, because all you got to do is notice whether the stimulus is identical or similar to the one previously experienced or learned. Recall is an example of that kind of question on a test, is a fill in the blank. So the question is asked, and you got to totally recall from memory what the response is. As we get older, as we get more training, as we learn our capabilities, we get better at the strategies involved in this. So a student, if they're going to be doing a fill in the blank task, and I've seen this before, and I've given this example before to my students, if you're going to do a fill in the blanks, I've seen students, as soon as they get their test, they start writing all the words that they have been studying. And in a sense, they're kind of recalling their memory, and they're kind of making that test into more of a recognition. So in other words, they're creating their own word bank. So you could see how different structures, different capabilities, different strategies will help form the appropriate response. Concerning memory structures, there are two types of memory. There are short-term and long-term. Short-term also gets worded or referred to as working memory. In this type of memory structure, you could only pay attention to 7 plus or minus items or bits of information. So the max number that you could probably hold in your memory, in your working memory, is 9 items or 9 groupings. So you are very limited on that. You typically rehearse. If you are trying to get a number from someone or a combination or a series of letters or numbers, you try to rehearse that until you actually are able to write it down, or you rehearse it enough to store it up into long-term memory. So what I want to do here, and I do this in my class, is I want to show you folks a letter sequence. There's a bunch of letters, and they're going to be in a particular sequence. I'm going to show it to you for about 10 seconds. And after the 10 seconds, I'm going to make that disappear, and I'm going to see who, and I typically ask this in my class, who will be able to recall that letter sequence in the appropriate manner. So here we go. Okay, that was a little bit more than 10 seconds. It was like closer to 12 seconds. Anyhow, does anyone, and then I would ask my students, does anyone recall in the right sequence that letter sequence? And typically students are not able to recall it correctly. Most of the students are able to remember, most of the students are able to remember probably the first sequence and probably the last sequence. I purposely put on there, I purposely put these words there, and now what I've done, I've taken this long sequence, which is rather long, and I've kind of broken it up based, and you folks might not be able to see this, but these are part of UT system schools. UT is University of Texas, UTA, which is University of Texas at Arlington, UTEP means El Paso, and of course UTSA. The word in the middle there is PhD. I typically try to promote graduate work among our undergrad students, so there's your message there with my students. But anyhow, most of the students will probably remember the AM, PM, and they usually remember of this sequence. Some of them will probably remember UTSA, and there'll be some other words that they will remember them, and they'll kind of bundle them up. But if you were a student and you are part of the UT system, and if you were to see this sequence, and you within those 10 seconds, you were able to chunk to group some of those words. You made those words relevant to you, made them meaningful to you, and you were able to group them. Then you would have more success, more likelihood of success if you did do that, as opposed to just trying to recall that letter sequence without any kind of grouping or concerning long-term memory. It seems to be more capabilities or lack of capabilities concerning our. There is an unlimited capacity. There's a limited duration. What we do know is that most of us do recall something that happened to us if we are to remember around 5 years of age. And even the youngest that we get to go is about 3 years of age. Something happens between 2 and 3, and somehow there's a break in our memory. We know that 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds have long-term memory. If we tell a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old that as soon as daddy gets home from work, we're going to go to the zoo, that child's going to remember that when the parent comes home, that child's going to be ready to go to the zoo. So we know that 1-year-olds do have the long-term memory. The question is why research hasn't been able to show or show any proof as to why there's a disengagement between 2 and 3 years of age. And after 3 years, we tend to have a little bit more memory structures as opposed concerning long-term, as opposed to when we were 1 or 2. So concerning our memory structures, here's another way that students using this kind of model. So you have the environment, you have the short-term memory, you have the long-term memory here associated with this, and you always work off this short-term memory. So the example that I always give to my students is my desk, my office. And I tell them what happens, and we do require a paper in my class, but I tell them, what if your paper, the paper that you turn in for this class in this semester, is the greatest, most awesome paper you have ever written? And so you give me a hard copy of it, and I grade it, and you get a grade for it, and you're very happy with that grade because it's the greatest paper you ever written. Well, 5 years from now, you've graduated, and you have this awesome career, and your employer at your career tells you to turn in the greatest work that you have ever done, a paper. And it's been 5 years, so your computer by then is outdated, so you got a new computer. Your flash drives are probably no longer there with you anymore, and you don't have an electronic copy of it anymore. So you remember that you turned in this great, awesome paper in my class. So you call me up and you say, Dr. Cordova, this is so and so, and do you remember that awesome paper that I turned in for you in my class? I'm going to say, yes, I do remember that paper because it was the greatest paper I've ever read. So then I'll ask them, I do have it. That's my working memory. It's my front desk right there on my desk. And I say, yes, I have it somewhere. I have it in long-term memory. My cabinet represents my long-term memory. I have it in my long-term cabinet. When you come and see me, I'll go in long-term memory, retrieve that, move that over to the front to my desk so that way I can work off of it and give it to you. So fine, we set up an appointment. You come and see me, and you arrived. I tell you, okay, great, good to see you. We talk about your work, and then I go to my long-term cabinet, my long-term memory. I open the cabinet, and I just look for your paper. What if the day that you turn in your assignment, and I graded it, and it's at the end of the semester, and what if I grab all those papers from all those students and just threw them into my long-term memory cabinet? What would happen when you come and see me? Would I be able to retrieve your paper? And it's been 5 years. So fall, spring, and summer courses that I teach, I have all turned in a paper. And now I had all those students turn in papers throughout the whole semesters. How will my file cabinet, my long-term memory be if all I did was throw your paper in there? It would be very hard for me. It would be very time consuming for me to pull that paper out. But what if, on the opposite side, what if when you turn them in, I have a cabinet, a long-term memory cabinet, a file cabinet, and on that cabinet, all I do is I have folders by year, by semester, by courses, and then even by then, I have the assignments in separate folders, and within those folders, I have all the student words by alphabetical order by last name. So you come and see me. I'm working off my working memory, and which is represented by my desk. I ask for your last name. I ask you what year did you take my course? What semester did you take it? I would go into the file cabinet, my long-term memory file cabinet. I retrieve that folder from that year, from that semester. I look at it. I give it. I look for your last name. Since they're based in alphabetical order, I pull that one out and I give it to you. That represents how we sometimes store things in a long-term memory. Some of us just get memory and we try to store it and we just throw it in there. There's no file cabinet, there's no rehearsal, there's no coding that takes place, and so our decisions and our retrieval of that memory has the potential to be interfered and disruptive with other types of memory. So therefore our motor response or our response output is going to be affected by that. So that's kind of the example that I give to my students concerning that model of how we are able to encode that memory. There are another notion concerning memory consolidation, which I do cover in future chapters, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But there is a component concerning memory concerning that. So the memory abilities. So concerning how if we do truly have recognition and recall. So recognition memory is typically evident after birth. So an infant is able to recognize certain things. We could look at it behaviorally based on eye gaze. They habituate to a response. So in other words, the reaction to a stimulus declines. So if you keep on showing the same stimulus, that response to that stimulus diminishes. That's what they do a lot with phobias or fears of individuals. So if someone's very fearful of snakes, they put them and they start showing them pictures of snakes. They do that with like nursing students that are kind of have fear of blood. They just keep on showing them blood and blood and blood. And so their physiological responses to that diminish. The other part of it is dishabituation. So it's a renewed response to a new stimulus. So whenever we have something that is being repeated on a day-to-day basis, our response to that diminishes because we see it, we know it, we expect it. But when you remove that stimulus, then we kind of get in line and we get a new response to that, and which is dishabituation. And so we know that early after birth, young infants do have recognition memory. Recall memory doesn't happen till a little bit later. Like I just said, recognition is more primitive. So recall takes a little bit more time to become evident around 2 years of age. And like I said, language. We do have, not only do we have recognition and recall, but we do have another type of memory called cued recall or contextual learning. In this type of recall, it's not necessarily a recognition, but there's a cue in the environment that helps us to respond appropriately. So in this experiment, what they did is they got an infant and they tied a string to a mobile on one of the legs. And of course, this infant ends up realizing that whenever they kick their left leg, this mobile device goes off, and it's very exciting for the infant. So in time, the child ends up learning, and that in this kind of setting, every time they kick their left leg, this mobile device is going to go off. Well, what these experimenters did is they removed that crib lining, those bed sheets, and when they put a different context, that infant had a hard time or had to relearn that leg was tied to this mobile, and therefore it took them time to realize that. One of the examples that I give with my students is definitely if you're in the coaching aspect, physical therapist or therapy, rehab settings, or even if you're a physical trainer, you always want to put your clients or your athletes in the real life situation. If all you do and you concentrate with your athletes or your clients is just in a control setting in your lab or in your clinic or in the gym, and you never put them in a real life situation, in a game like situation, they might not be able to respond appropriately. And that's kind of what I was referring to in that Super Bowl play. This individual, this defensive player, Butler, he looked at that formation, he practiced that formation, he saw that formation in video, he was able to see that how the receivers were lined up, how the linemen were lined up, how the quarterback and the running back were lined up. Therefore, he knew the response, he gave him a cue, he knew where to go, and he definitely jumped on that ball and, of course, we know the results of the New England Patriots winning that game because of that one incredible play that this player did. So we know that context. The memory abilities, here are some short-term memory abilities just to kind of summarize. They improve with early adolescence. We tend to only have 7 plus or minus 2 digits or bits of information. We know that strategies matter. And we also, didn't include this yet, but we also know that location tends to be better receptive of the individual's ability as opposed to distance. So what I have here are some devices, some electronic devices, and a lot of people do use these devices to read material. And it's easy because you could make notes and you could highlight things and it could be very efficient. But the problem with that is that it's always on the same screen space, on the same location. So you scroll up or down and you don't necessarily flip a screen. Well, that's what people with technology and this type of research is showing, that people recall that information less as opposed to if they actually had an article, a hardbound cover book, where they did turn the page and location, upper left, bottom left, corner in the middle, to the right of the picture and things like that. They're able to remember that a lot richer than as opposed to these kind of devices. They've done this experiment with children as well. They blindfolded them, they put them through certain mazes, through locations, and of course, children are able to recall location better, significantly better than distance. Concerning long-term memory, we know that around 2 years, and it might have to do with language. We don't know, like I said, with research, we don't know why 1-year-olds are not able to tell us some things once they get older. But a lot of it has to do with the strategies that are there, and it has to do with the retrieval of that information. And not only that, but the continuous movements, those skills like riding a bike, tend to be able to be retrieved later in life as opposed to discrete skills. So there is a lot of research concerning this. Discrete skills are those that definitely have a start and an end, and there tends to be less evidence that we tend to retain some of those motor skills, discrete motor skills, as opposed to continuous motor skills. We know that chess players or knowledge of the game matter. When you have great knowledge of a particular venue or sport, you tend to be able to chunk information. You're better to strategize what kind of moves or positions to do. So we know that knowledge helps an individual's performance. We know that meta memory, you know that you know. So knowledge or intuition that people have about memory and themselves, of what works for them. So people, some of my students retype their notes. Some of them highlight, but some of them read the books and they make that correlation. They do all these kind of pictures because they know that those things work for them. So they have those different types of strategies to be able to understand that material. So this is kind of a memory summary. So we have recognition, which is habituation, which we know that newborns have. Cued recall, they get a little bit later. So if you're able to give them some kind of cue, they're able to recall and select the appropriate response. And of course, contextual learning kind of emerges around 6 months. We have recall, which is short-term and long-term memory. Long-term memory kind of is evident after 2 years of age. And we know that as you get older and you get better at meta memory, which is that ability to know what works best. So that concludes my presentation. I try to keep it within 30 minutes, and I think I have been successful in doing that. I appreciate you able to listen to my media presentation. And if there's any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. And thank you.